Have you ever watched dignity being torn from a man simply because he dared to dream of freedom? Imagine the soil of this land, our land, soaked not just with sweat, but with humiliation. Patriots who rise before dawn to feed their children, only to bow before red-coated masters who see them as nothing but rebels and dirt. Have you ever felt powerless? While wealthy British officers toast to their glory, farmers starve. While polished boots march through our towns, brave militia soldiers are beaten in the street, stripped of rights, pride and hope. Mothers forced to kneel, children ordered to salute the flag of their oppressors. Betrayal everywhere, sacrifice ignored. And yet, the spirit of the patriot refuses to die. Stay with me until the end, because the struggle for freedom does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the heart, when a man chooses dignity over fear, even if the world laughs at him for it. What you are about to hear may shock you, a story of pain and of unbreakable resolve, of humiliation and the courage to rise again.
Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed. Give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story.
The sun burned low over the fields when 5 weary Patriot militiamen approached Abraham Cole's modest farm, their uniforms torn, their faces hardened by persecution. At their head stood Captain Samuel Hawke, a man marked by the scars of rebellion, both visible and carved into his soul. They were fugitives now, chased like hunted animals for refusing to bow to British tyranny and unbearable taxes that strangled every honest home. Abraham, leaning on his worn crutch, felt the old pain in his missing leg, but also the fire that still lived inside him. Without hesitation, he invited them in. He offered what little he had, bread baked by his trembling hands, water pulled from the well moments before his strength failed. He smiled with humble pride, whispering that liberty must be nourished to survive, fed even in the darkest times, especially when hope seems lost. His house was tiny, but his heart was vast. Inside, laughter faded quickly into grim silence as Captain Hawke unrolled a hidden letter. A parchment sealed with the King's mark, stolen from a corrupt British officer. Its contents revealed a plan: harsher levies, more troops to crush dissent, and a list of colonists to be made examples of, names to be burned into history through suffering, and there, among them, Abraham Cole. The old farmer felt his breath falter. It wasn't enough that they had taken his leg, now they wanted his spirit. The Crown wanted to erase every symbol of defiance in the colonies, starting with the vulnerable, the humble, men like him. Fear flickered in his eyes, but not for himself. He worried for his neighbors, for children forced to watch their fathers humiliated, for families who believed the lies fed by British nobles promising protection while sharpening their knives. Captain Hawke placed his hand on Abraham's shoulder. He called him a patriot, a fighter who had already sacrificed more than most. Abraham disagreed. He saw himself as broken, half a man, but the soldiers saw something else, a testament, proof that rebellion is born not from strength, but from wounds that never healed. As night fell, torches ignited at the edge of the property. Redcoats, dozens, their boots stomped like thunder, their voices thundered with threats and insults. They demanded Hawke's surrender. They mocked Abraham, calling him a crippled disgrace unworthy of life, spitting contempt upon his land, upon everything he loved. Anger boiled in the air. The Patriots braced for a hopeless fight, 5 against many, a farm against an empire. Abraham clenched his jaw. Betrayal tasted bitter on his tongue. Once he had trusted the Crown. Once he believed loyalty would protect him. But oppression had stripped away every illusion. He looked at his crutch, then at the musket above his hearth. A decision was taking shape, a transformation he never wished for, a revelation born from suffering, Freedom demands a price. And even a man with one leg can stand tall for liberty. But before destiny struck, before a single shot fired, a trembling voice broke the silence. A voice carrying both fear and courage. Abraham's granddaughter Eleanor, clutching a small flag she sewed in secret. A banner of rebellion she believed in with all her heart. The soldiers outside roared again. Threats, demands, promises of degradation. Abraham turned to the door, his face illuminated by the flickering flame of a candle struggling against the darkness. His journey was no longer about survival. It was about dignity. The time had come to confront the iron fist that tried to crush the soul of a people longing for independence. The storm outside would decide their fate, but not their honor. The loyalist spy galloped into the night with a twisted grin, clutching the secret he had witnessed like a weapon. Abraham's kindness, his simple act of offering bread and water to exhausted patriots, would now be painted as treason. Betrayal had found its sharpest blade in a neighbor who once shared meals at his table. That was the cruelty of tyranny. It corrupted faith, poisoned trust, turned brother against brother for a few coins and a pat on the head from the crown. Captain Nathaniel Graves was the kind of man mothers warned their children about. A British officer with a refined voice and a taste for pain. He tortured colonists not only to break their bodies, but to shatter their dignity. He believed fear was stronger than hope. He believed obedience was stronger than liberty. And he believed that patriots were insects to be crushed beneath polished boots. When the spy delivered his accusation, Graves didn't ask for evidence. He didn't question motives. He merely smiled, that cold, delighted smile of a predator who scents fresh blood. He gathered his men, saddled his horse, and rode toward Abraham's farm, hunger for domination burning in his eyes. Meanwhile, inside that fragile wooden house, Abraham stood guard, musket in hand, heart pounding like a war drum. Captain Hawke checked the sharpened bayonets. The other militiamen exchanged firm nods, ready to sacrifice their lives rather than kneel. Even little Eleanor, clutching her homemade rebel flag, refused to hide. Her gaze never wavered. She believed in independence more fiercely than many grown men. Torches soon blazed through the darkness. The night smelled of smoke and contempt. British soldiers surrounded the home, shouting insults, demanding all rebels surrender. Their laughter echoed like devils celebrating. They called Abraham a crippled dog, a disgrace, less than human. They mocked his missing leg as proof that rebellion only leads to shame and ruin. Abraham felt the humiliation stab deeper than any sword. But from that very wound, courage rose. He remembered the day they took his leg, British officers storming his farm under the excuse of unpaid taxes. He remembered being dragged across dirt, the agony, the scream he swallowed to keep his pride. They thought they broke him. They never understood that real strength isn't measured by limbs, but by the will to still stand. Captain Graves emerged from the crowd, mounted high like a self-proclaimed god. He announced that anyone helping rebels would pay with flesh, that every patriot cause would be erased. The crown would grind rebellion into dust. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Abraham raised his crutch like a banner of defiance. He spoke few words, words that carried the fury of every oppressed soul. Liberty is worth more than fear. Even the wind seemed to tremble. Graves' face twisted with rage. He ordered his men to seize the old farmer alive, to make an example of him, to turn his sacrifice into a warning. Soldiers advanced, muskets aimed, torches flared brighter. The house felt suddenly smaller, encircled by hatred. Inside, Captain Hawke stepped forward, eyes burning with determination. He would not abandon Abraham. He would not allow another patriot heart to be crushed under redcoat cruelty. A final decision surged among them, a revelation that survival is hollow without dignity. 5 rebels, 1 elderly farmer, a child holding a symbol of rebellion, and an empire ready to strike. The air tasted like destiny. Dawn arrived without mercy. The first light crept over the hills like a warning, but the redcoats showed no patience for omens. 20 armed soldiers thundered onto Abraham Cole's land, kicking up dust and contempt with every step. Captain Nathaniel Graves dismounted slowly, savoring the fear he expected to see. His polished boots hit the ground with the arrogance of a man convinced he owned everything under the sun. "Filthy Yankee rebel scum!" he spat, circling Abraham like a vulture. "Dig your own grave with your useless stump, old dog." Shame struck harder than any whip. The soldiers seized Abraham, wrenching away his crutch, forcing him to hop and stumble in the dirt. They tied him to a post, the rope biting into his weathered skin. The rising sun blazed above him like a cruel overseer, turning sweat into fire. Graves demanded he claw at the dry earth with his stump. When Abraham hesitated, a musket butt smashed his ribs, stealing breath and dignity at once. Blood stained the soil he had spent his life tending. Every scrape of his flesh against that ground was a declaration of what tyranny sought to reduce him to, a symbol of rebellion they wanted to erase. Laughter from red-coated mouths echoed, each insult a dagger, meant to kill his spirit. They called him a crippled rat, a broken traitor, a lesson. The loyalist spy watched from afar, pride swelling in his treacherous chest. Betrayal had purchased him false favor, but Abraham was not alone. Inside the battered farmhouse, Captain Hawke and the 5 militiamen held their breath, trapped between impossible decisions. If they charged now, they would die. If they remained hidden, a good man would be consumed by degradation designed to crush the will of every colonist who heard the tale. Eleanor's small hand gripped Hawke's sleeve. Her eyes, wide but fierce, begged for action. Her homemade banner of independence lay folded against her heart, threads trembling with purpose. She could not watch the only father figure she had left become a symbol of submission. Abraham's fingers dug into the earth. Dirt filled his nails, mixing with blood and tears. The pain was savage, but deeper still was the wounded pride of a patriot being treated as if he were less than human. He prayed that if this was his final trial, his suffering might become a spark, igniting hearts across the colonies to resist shame and reclaim honor. Graves leaned close, voice dripping poison. "Your rebellion ends in disgrace. Look how your liberty tastes now." He kicked the hole Abraham had begun digging, cackling as the old man crumpled forward, rope cutting deeper. But the captain misread what he saw. He mistook agony for defeat. What truly churned beneath Abraham's bowed head was transformation, a revelation carved through pain. The crown feared men like him not because he was weak, but because he refused to kneel. The soldiers' jeers grew louder. The sun climbed higher. Sweat, dirt, and blood formed a mask of defiance on Abraham's face. He whispered a single promise through clenched teeth, a vow of independence that no lash could silence. Hawke's jaw tightened. The militiamen exchanged a single look. Decisions were forged in that silence. Sacrifice would come, but they would not allow tyranny to bury a patriot alive. The rebellion's fire was about to erupt from the dust. Night settled heavy over the farm, wrapping the fields in a suffocating darkness. The redcoats made camp, their laughter flickering with the torches as if cruelty itself found comfort in fire. Abraham remained tied to the post, body slumped, lips cracked like dry earth. Every breath felt like a battle. His stump throbbed with raw agony, blood drying into a dark stain that told the story of his punishment. He tried to pray, but the words faltered. He feared his voice would break before his spirit did. Not every soldier watching him was made of stone. Private Thomas Miller stood at the edge of the light, helmet in his shaking hands. He was barely more than a boy, drafted from a poor English family that the crown promised would prosper if he served. lies wrapped in flags, delivered by noblemen who never tasted war. Thomas had believed them once, but the screams of colonists haunted his sleep. This was not honor. This was degradation as entertainment. He waited until the others drifted into drunken slumber. Fear gnawed his guts as he filled a small flask at the water barrel. He moved slowly, each step a crime punishable by death. When he reached Abraham, the moon revealed a face almost ghostly, drained of color, but not of resolve. Thomas leaned close, making sure no one saw. He brushed a few drops of water across Abraham's lips, his voice trembling like a confession. "No man deserves this, not even a rebel," humanity whispered through that single act of mercy. Abraham opened his eyes. The world blurred, but the compassion he saw in the young soldier's gaze was unmistakable. A revelation struck him. Even within the ranks of tyranny, doubt was blooming. The crown could command bodies, but not hearts, not forever. The soldier stepped back quickly, fear swallowing his courage. If his officers noticed, he too would face disgrace and torture. Yet he looked once, more at Abraham, almost pleading for forgiveness he did not know how to ask. Abraham's breath rattled, but he forced out a rasped fragment of dignity. "You still see a man." Those words hit Thomas harder than any musket recoil. He turned away, tears burning. He had been told patriots were animals, rabid villains hungry for chaos. But here stood a farmer willing to bleed for a liberty Thomas had never dared to imagine for himself. Dawn threatened the horizon again. Graves would be awake soon, ready to continue his spectacle of torment, ready to turn Abraham into an example, ready to extort screams for the sake of dominance. But something had changed overnight. A hidden truth had taken root. Rebellion was not only on one side of the rope. Inside the house, Captain Hawke watched silently through a cracked shutter. He had seen the covert act of compassion, and he understood what it meant. The struggle was larger than muskets and land. It was a war for the soul of every person under British rule, even those wearing the red coat. The journey ahead promised sacrifice, revelations that would test loyalties, decisions that would alter destinies. Independence demanded more than bravery. It demanded transformation. The sun's first rays crawled over the farm once more. The birds did not sing. The wind held no peace. The hour of brutal reckoning had arrived again, but this time eyes were opening, hearts were shifting, and the soil beneath Abraham contained not only his blood, but the seeds of uprising. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. The forest stood silent as Captain Samuel Hawke listened to the trembling farmer's words. Every detail struck like flint against steel. Abraham tied to a post, the stump he once used to stand proud now, forced to dig his own grave. British boots grinding his dignity into the dirt. Rage thundered through Hawke's chest. His jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The farmer's voice cracked with fear, but Hawke's gaze sharpened with purpose. No king buries a patriot alive, he growled, each syllable a spark of rebellion. Saddle the horses. Tonight we ride. The 5 militiamen rose without hesitation. Their faces were carved by exhaustion and sorrow, but their spirits burned fierce. They strapped blades to their belts, loaded muskets with trembling yet determined hands. The night around them pulsed with urgency. The air tasted of iron and fate. Abraham's suffering had transformed their mission. It was no longer survival. It was justice. The old farmer had given them sanctuary when the crown hunted them like beasts. Now they would return that loyalty with steel and sacrifice. Hawke mounted his horse and looked toward the distant farm. He imagined Abraham alone in the sun, mocked as a cripple, degraded like an animal. The shame inflicted on him echoed the torment of thousands across the colonies. Every insult thrown his way was thrown at every man, woman and child who dared dream of independence. Tyranny believed humiliation could crush the patriot soul, But humiliation is a forge. It shapes warriors. Eleanor's flag remained hidden inside the farmhouse, waiting for hands brave enough to raise it high. That small cloth, stitched with trembling fingers, held more power than every British cannon. It represented a choice: obedience or liberty, chains or dignity. Hawke's fury darkened into clarity. Graves' cruelty was not punishment. It was fear disguised as dominance. Kings terrorize the people they know are rising, and rebellion had already begun, not in speeches or councils, but in bleeding hands clawing at the soil, refusing to surrender identity. The journey back to the farm stretched long and shadowed, but every beat of the horses' hooves declared defiance. The trees seemed to bow aside for them, as if nature itself stood with the Patriots. The militiamen rode faster, driven by the vision of Abraham collapsing under the sun, praying for liberation stronger than life itself. Hawke's mind raced. He remembered his mother kneeling before a British officer who laughed while confiscating their crops. He remembered the lashings given to men who couldn't pay unjust taxes. Betrayal was not new, but witnessing an elder forced to dig his own grave, that was beyond cruelty. That was a message. The Crown wanted obedience. The Patriots would deliver rebellion. Clouds thickened above, smothering moonlight, as if the heavens prepared to witness judgment. The soldiers gripped their muskets, knowing the night ahead could be their last. Fear scratched at them, but pride stood taller. Better to die upright than live bowed. As they emerged from the woods, the distant glow of torches flickered like angry stars. Abraham's torment was not yet finished, but nor was his story. His degradation had awakened something ancient and unstoppable, and Hawke was determined to show Graves the true cost of pushing a patriot too far. Blood would decide Dawn's allegiance. Moonlight spilled across the farm like a pale witness to the crimes of empire. Shadows stretched and trembled as Captain Hawke and his men crept through the tall grass, every movement fueled by fury and devotion. The redcoats on watch lounged lazily near the dying torches, convinced that terror had already broken the old farmer. They didn't see resistance stalking toward them with quiet, burning purpose. Steel flashed. A gasp. A thud. The cruel guard who had mocked Abraham earlier collapsed into the dirt he once believed he owned. His musket never fired. His arrogance died with him. Another soldier stumbled awake, but seeing death already looming, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands. It was Private Miller. Tears stained his cheeks. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, voice shattered by guilt. "Let me leave this war, please." He looked at Abraham, still tied to the post, barely conscious but unbroken. Miller bowed his head in shame. "He is more of a man than any officer I've served." Hawke stared at him, weighing the soul behind the uniform. Then he nodded once. Mercy was a patriot's strength. "Go, choose a life where dignity still breathes." Miller fled into the night, leaving behind the chains the Crown forged for him. Hawke knelt beside Abraham. The ropes cut deep, but the spirit beneath them remained untouched. Carefully, he untied the knots, lifting the wounded farmer into his arms as if carrying a fallen flag. "Sir," he said, voice thick with reverence, "your courage carries the spirit of rebellion, farther than any musket." Abraham tried to speak, but sound failed him. His lips cracked into a weak smile instead. He was nearly weightless, skin and bone held together by pride alone. Eleanor rushed from the farmhouse, sobbing as she hugged her grandfather's good leg, her tiny hands shaking with both terror and relief. Hawke promised her that no tyrant would ever drag Abraham into despair again. Yet the danger had not passed. A horn blast split the night, sharp, furious, unmistakable. "Captain." Graves had discovered the silent attack, and his wrath ignited like powder. Torches flared alive, boots pounded with vengeance, orders roared through the darkness, filled with threats of slaughter. The Patriots had mere seconds. The militiamen formed a protective ring around Abraham and Eleanor, muskets raised, eyes cold with readiness. They knew escape would require sacrifice. They knew rebellion demanded blood. The wind itself paused, sensing the storm about to break. Graves rode forward, his sneer twisting into something monstrous. The humiliation he meant to inflict now returned to him as rage. "Traitors!" he bellowed. "You think you can steal back a corpse destined for the grave?" Abraham forced himself upright, leaning on Hawk, his voice low, but laced with iron. "A patriot does not die by the command of a crown, only by the choice of God and country." Graves snarled, signaling his men to aim. The patriots braced. Eleanor gripped her flag tighter, its defiant colors fluttering, like a heartbeat against tyranny. Even Abraham, barely standing, lifted his chin to face the empire that sought to bury him. Across that tense field, a single truth became unavoidable. Britain feared the colonists, not because they were weak, but because they refused to kneel. The night held its breath, waiting to see whose courage would write the first line of freedom at sunrise. Muskets shook, hearts thundered. The journey toward independence demanded another step, one that would echo far beyond. This farm. Captain Nathaniel Graves basked in his own cruelty inside the grand Loyalist manor, a stolen jewel in the countryside. Velvet and silver, maps spread across a polished table, trophies from crushed families hung like warnings on the walls. He toasted with wealthy merchants who profited from colonial misery. Their laughter was thick with arrogance. They celebrated the humiliation of farmers as though it were sport. Graves boasted loudly, pride sharp as a blade. He spoke of patriots as insects beneath his heel. He bragged of breaking Abraham Cole, of forcing a wounded elder to claw the earth like a dying animal. The nobles applauded his barbarity, blind to the transformation they had sparked in a land already hungry for liberty. But a knock cut through their gloating. A Patriot envoy entered, boots muddy, eyes alight with defiance. He carried no weapon, only resolve. Every Loyalist hand reached for a sword, but Graves raised his palm, intrigued by the audacity. The messenger delivered Captain Hawke's declaration with steady voice. "If you claim honor, prove it. Face a patriot steel to steel. Let dignity decide whose cause is righteous." Graves smirked, delighted by the opportunity to parade his supremacy. "A duel?" he sneered. "I will enjoy watching rebellion bleed." But the envoy wasn't finished. "There will be a judge," he continued, "a man whose strength you tried to bury. Abraham Cole will witness justice rise against tyranny." The room fell still. Even the candles seemed to shrink from the shock. The merchants whispered that Abraham was already a ghost, that no broken farmer could stand again. But Graves' smile faltered just for a breath. The idea that the crippled rebel still lived, still had a voice, gnawed at his pride. He accepted the challenge, furious to prove his power. "At dawn," Graves declared, "let the countryside watch their hero crumble." Word spread fast. Poor farmers left their fields. Militia fighters hidden in the hills stirred. Women and children, elders and laborers, every soul who had tasted British contempt made the journey. They gathered in silence at the edge of Abraham's land, where tyranny once forced a man to dig his own tomb. Now that same soil would witness a reckoning. Hawke supported Abraham as he arrived, the old man using his crutch not for balance, but as a staff of defiance. His face carried the scars of suffering, but his eyes held a fire that even kings couldn't extinguish. Eleanor walked beside him, her tiny flag clutched like a holy relic. She refused to let the symbol of independence fall from her hands. Graves waited, dressed not in battlefield armor but polished elegance, confident he would win not just the duel, but the narrative of domination. He bowed mockingly, as if mocking the idea that rebellion had dignity. Abraham stared at him with solemn resolve. He spoke not of vengeance, but of truth. This ground knows the difference between honor and shame. It will remember who stood for liberty and who stood for cruelty. The sun threatened to break the horizon, bathing the arena in red like a prophecy. The colonies held their breath. The duel would not merely decide one life over another. It would reveal whether a battered patriot spirit could still challenge the crown that sought to silence him. In the stillness before steel clashed, one certainty emerged like sunlight through fog. Independence is born from those who refuse to kneel. The crowd held its breath as the duelists faced one another. 30 paces of dirt stretched between tyranny and defiance. Captain Graves smirked with the arrogance of a man who believed power was his birthright. Captain Hawke stood tall, jaw set, hands steady, every heartbeat aligned with the promise of independence. Abraham Cole, frail yet unbowed, was led to the center. He leaned on his crutch, his stump swollen and bleeding beneath the torn pant leg, but his eyes were fierce, illuminated by the courage of a wounded nation. Silence choked the air. No birds dared sing. The wind itself seemed to kneel before the moment. 6 bullets would decide which side history remembered as righteous. Abraham's hand, what remained of it, rose slowly. A trembling stump, once mocked, now held the power to command the fate of an empire. His breath shuddered through cracked lips, but his voice, silent, spoke louder than any drum of war. Fire. Graves shot first. Fear twisted his aim. His bullet tore through empty sky, a coward's mark. He fired again, wild and frantic, as if trying to kill the very spirit rising against him. Smoke erupted from his pistol in nervous bursts. None found their target. Hawke did not rush. He inhaled the courage of every farmer who ever bled for dignity. He exhaled centuries of oppression. He pulled the trigger once, a single thunderous report. Graves staggered. Confusion flashed across his face, shock that rebellion dared answer back. Another shot rang, then another, each struck with the precision of conviction. Blood bloomed across the officer's pristine coat, staining the very symbol of British pride. He collapsed into the dust he had believed he owned forever. The ground that once bore Abraham's tears now swallowed the tyrant's blood. For a heartbeat, there was only stillness. Then gasps rippled through the gathered colonists, fear and awe merging into a powerful clarity. Arrogant merchants and loyalists stood pale, eyes wide with the revelation that the king's terror was not invincible. Farmers clenched fists once chained by obedience. Children saw that injustice could fall. Ordinary souls glimpsed a future not ruled by cruelty. Hawke lowered his pistol, chest rising with heavy breath. He did not gloat. He did not smile. Victory was not a celebration. It was a burden carried by the brave. Abraham looked upon the dying captain in silence. There was no joy in watching another man bleed, only justice reclaiming its rightful ground. He whispered a truth Graves would carry into the afterlife. No throne commands the heart of a patriot, but the morning brought no peace. British reinforcements approached. Drums thundered in the distance. Bayonets glinted like a fresh threat. The duel had struck a blow, but rebellion was still surrounded. The struggle for liberty would demand more sacrifice, more decisions, more transformation. The journey was far from done. Comment: I stand with the Patriots. British soldiers who once jeered at Abraham now stared in stunned silence as their proud captain lay dying in the same dust he had forced a patriot to claw. The humiliation he intended for others now consumed him. His breath rattled, shallow and frantic. Hawke ordered that the grave Graves mocked into existence be completed by the man who tried to bury liberty itself. Hands that once cracked, whips now scraped helplessly at the cold ground. Dirt packed beneath his fingernails. The taste of disgrace filled his mouth. He looked up at the gathered troops, expecting loyalty, finding only distance. Their discipline wavered. Their eyes darted away from his suffering. Oppression had lost its mask. Cruelty stood naked before them. Hawke stepped forward, voice ringing out like a church bell calling souls to truth. "Oppression buries itself," he declared. "Patriots rise." The words cut deeper than bullets. Abraham, still trembling, stood with his crutch as support, but not as a symbol of weakness. His one leg held firmer than all the polished boots that trembled around. He lifted his chin. His ruined stump bled through torn cloth, yet he felt taller than any king. This land had tried to break him. Instead, it forged him into the voice of American freedom. "Look at him," Hawke said. "A farmer, a grandfather, a man they called crippled and useless. But dignity cannot be amputated. Liberty cannot be silenced by fear." The colonists watching stepped closer, drawing courage from the sight. Mothers pulled their children forward to witness a truth no textbook would one day need to explain. Elders whispered prayers not for mercy but for strength. Worn hands that once sowed fields now clenched into fists. A transformation swept through the crowd, a revelation that their suffering was not shameful but righteous, that every tax, every insult, every night soaked in tears had paved the journey to this moment. Independence was no longer an idea whispered in shadows. It breathed, it bled, it stood on one leg and still refused to kneel. Graves collapsed. Fully, face pressed into the earth he once called his own. His voice gurgled something like a plea, but no one moved to help. His soldiers saw not a leader, but the inevitable fate of tyranny. Thomas Miller emerged from the tree line, eyes lowered, torn between the uniform he wore and the truth he had witnessed. He knelt before Abraham, not in worship, but in recognition. "Forgive me," he said. "I was blind." Abraham placed his weathered hand upon the young man's shoulder. "Then rise. Walk your own path to dignity." A distant drumroll shattered the fragile quiet. Reinforcements were coming. More redcoats, more bayonets, more chains for those who dared to breathe freedom's air. The flames of rebellion would soon be tested by a flood of steel. But the people did not scatter. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who survived disgrace to become a symbol. They raised their heads toward the storm. British might would fall upon them soon, but fear was no longer welcome here. This land had found its voice, and its voice was ready to fight. The thunder of British drums drew closer, a reminder that tyranny never surrenders quietly. Yet on that humble stretch of Virginia soil, a new truth stood unshakable. Abraham Cole, once mocked as a stuttering, one-legged farmer, had risen above shame and transformed into a symbol no empire could silence. His courage lit a spark that leapt from heart to heart, a spark that would soon set an entire continent ablaze with the cry of independence. Hawke and the Patriot militiamen formed a shield around him, prepared to sacrifice everything for the dignity of a man who refused to bow. Children watched with wide eyes, learning that rebellion was not chaos. Rebellion was honor. Mothers felt pride surge in place of fear. Elders wiped tears, understanding that the journey toward liberty often begins with a single wounded voice daring to say no more. The redcoats marched closer, bayonets lowered, but something in the air had shifted. It was no longer the silence of despair. It was the hush before a nation roars. The oppressed had discovered their strength, buried deep beneath years of humiliation and betrayal. Transformation had taken root. Justice demanded to be heard. And though the cost would be high, the colonies would no longer endure degradation as destiny. Abraham stared at the horizon where dawn and danger met. "Let them come," he murmured. "My soul kneels to no crown." Those words were not loud, yet they echoed like thunder, because liberty has a memory, a heartbeat, a name. From that day forward, the struggle for American independence carried his spirit, his sacrifice, his refusal to let cruelty define him. He stood not as a hero carved in stone, but as a farmer who believed that human dignity is worth any wound. The flame he ignited would guide countless patriots through the darkest nights of war, through loss, through doubt, through blood that watered the roots of a newborn nation. That is, how a crippled elder became the voice of a people rising. And now, if this story has stirred something deep within you, if your heart beat faster when oppression trembled, then you are part of that legacy too. Our bond is forged by courage and remembrance. Honor their struggle by standing alongside them, not in silence, but with conviction. Like this video, if your spirit rose with Abraham's. Subscribe to keep walking this path of memory, so these sacrifices are never forgotten. Write in the T. Comments with pride. The flame of freedom burns in me. Because the fight for dignity never ends, it only changes hands. Here is another story of courage and sacrifice. Click and continue the journey with me.